This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. A couple of years ago, I sat down for a meal with a friend of mine who specializes in international law and is currently working at the UN. And of course, one bottle, then two bottles, and three bottles of wine disappear. And the questions all start out simple. Like, who is liable for a parking ticket when a diplomat parks in a handicap spot? To questions around what the citizenship of a child would be being born in the UN building. But to this day, it is still one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had. Because then we started getting into more complicated topics, leading up to the conversation about private militaries. By the time we got to this point, we were 3 bottles of wine deep, and my friend had answers for almost everything. But when it came to private militaries, he exclaimed he had discussed it with colleagues, and there really is not much precedent to go off. So I posed him a scenario. If I were to work for a multinational oil company, for the sake of the argument ExxonMobil, and I wanted to boost my shares, what stops me hiring a military contractor with dark money to sail up to a competitor's oil rig and use a rocket or drone strike to blow it up? He looked perplexed and took a sip from his wine and then confirmed, well, of course that's illegal, and the oil company would sue you for the damages. But then I asked, who would you serve with a lawsuit? The man who fired the rocket? Well, he's probably long gone and living in Colombia by now. Good luck finding him. What about the man who sold him the rocket? Rockets are pretty easy to get these days, and change hands frequently. It would be nearly impossible to prove it came from one particular source. What about the company who employed him? Well, PMCs are likely registered in the UAE, or a small Caribbean island. Countries that have no laws on the books against this, and have vested interests to not press charges. What about if they sue me for paying for the attack? Well, it's not hard to route money through a few countries and banks who would simply refuse to continue the investigation. A single transaction can be quite difficult to tie to someone, particularly if they know what they're doing. And this stumped him. That's the conundrum of PMCs, because there is no precedent around them. Because nobody wants a precedent around them. As many countries today use them as shock forces or simply to do the dirty work they don't want to do. You can't send an Italian army to invade a Somali village, retake your goods and kill the pirates once and for all. That's an invasion of a sovereign nation by another nation. It's unthinkable. You can, though, hire a private company that will hire private contractors that will get the same job done, and none of the blame comes back to you. Just as messy, just as bloody, none of the blowback. At least for now. So if there are very little laws around this industry on the ground, there's even less laws around this industry in the ocean. For the most part, no one is even completely sure who would even be charged for a crime like this. And with much more players entering this space, how chaotic is this about to become? Well, to answer the question my friend couldn't, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Soldiers of Fortune.
Yeah, so private military services are not just land-bound, they are also on the sea. And they provide, for example, security to oil tankers and freighters who go through pirate-infested waters like the Gulf of Guinea in Africa, the Gulf of Aden, the Malacca Straits. And it's been an industry that's been around for about 10 years.
Sean Mcfate is a former private military contractor, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, professor of strategy at Georgetown University and the National Defense University, and the author of a number of fantastic books around the issue of PMCs. We are glad to have Sean back on the show today.
Volumes of ink have been spilled on the question of what's the difference between a private military company and a straight up mercenary. And the truth is, in my experience, having been in that world, is that the line is really blurry. I mean, if you could do one, you can do the other. It depends on the company or the individual's decisions and market circumstances. In the case of PMCs at sea, then what they are is they're civilians who deploy force in a way that perhaps a national Coast Guard would. And so they are non-state actors. and they are transactional. They work for money. They work for profit. And so we're seeing the private military companies, some would say mercenaries, or some might even say privateers, increasingly in the oceans.
So what are the rules of engagement when it comes to PMCs? A US naval boat can't go chasing pirates into Vietnamese territorial waters without the permission of the Vietnamese government, but PMCs are technically civilians. So what are the engagement rules around PMCs? Can they go chasing enemies into sovereign waters?
Yeah, it depends on who the client is. So if the client's the Vietnamese government, then you're basically acting as the Vietnamese government's Coast Guard or an auxiliary to the Coast Guard. And that happens especially when you have illegal fishing or poaching. So for example, Chinese fishing boats, like these ocean trawlers, go off of the coasts of Africa and will just scoop up as much fish as they can. And some of these states like Liberia and others are pretty powerless to stop it. And they don't have a Coast Guard of their own, or one that's very weak. So what they could do is they could contract one of these companies to act as their Coast Guard, in which case they are, I guess, legal. But you also have questions like this. You have, just say you're like a big shipping company like Maersk, and I'm making this up hypothetically, but you've had one of your a container ship just got taken over by pirates, and they want $5 million ransom. And you have to pay it, and then, that's a pain, and you lose money, and your insurance rates go up. So next time when you have a big cargo ship going through a pirate-infested water, you hire one of these companies, and they either have a separate boat that's armed, or they put armed people on your vessel to shoot and maybe kill pirates who might be boarding your vessel, sort of like the old days.
The claim at the moment is that this process of putting PMCs onto the boats has dramatically reduced the amount of piracy off the Gulf of Aden. But at the same time, these shipping companies have a pretty big incentive to not report the attacks to keep their insurance premiums low. How successful do you think these maritime PMC programs have actually been?
Well, it's partly true. There's a lot of things that dramatically reduce piracy. So about 10 years ago, some of your listeners will remember there was like this blight of pirates off of the coast of Somalia and the Gulf of Aden. Then, and there was a huge international uproar against us. There was a conglomeration of multiple states like China, the United States, and others, perhaps even Australia, I'm not sure, who sent like a task force. Like I think it's called Task Force 150 or something like that. That would, chase down these pirates. But if you think about it, you have these big Navy destroyers trying to chase down pirates who are operating on, rubber rafts, Zodiacs and rubber rigid speedcraft, Boston whalers. And many people in the Navy thought, this is not worth spending millions of dollars making naval destroyers chase down these pirates. So many admirals, if you like in America, if you talk to them, over drinks, they will quietly tell you that, I think it's good for merchant companies to hire embarked security, which means putting, these sort of anti-piracy armed guys on your vessels. At the same time, the insurance companies also sort of wink, nudge at that. And lastly, the international community, the United States and others, the Five Eyes to some extent, that's the intelligence alliance between the US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK, sought to really sort of paralyze the pirate system. There was a piracy system in Somalia. It wasn't just a bunch of bored fisher guys going out there. They had international financial backing. There were sort of tycoons in Somalia, I think maybe in Yemen, and they went after those financial guys too. And that's sort of what stopped it as well. They sort of interfered or sabotaged the way they get paid. And so there was a couple reasons why piracy started to dwindle by 2012.
So do you think this really did completely solve the piracy problem, or that people just simply aren't reporting the attacks?
It's a good question. So I think it's like, it's like banks. They're not going to report when they've been hacked and, how much money has been stolen by hackers. It's against their self-interest. And it's really hard to know because just like banks, these shipping companies and insurance companies are pretty sophisticated when it comes to information security and sensitivity. I think it's very likely that, piracy still continues. It didn't just simply vanish in 2012. I think the numbers of piracy has gone down. There was like the spike in 2010, 11, and 12, in the Gulf of Aden. But, there are other piracies around the world. That industry, it's one of the oldest industries in the world. So I don't think we should be too optimistic that the piracy problem has gone away. I think that's likely it has simply been concealed.
But it isn't just companies hiring these guys anymore. In the Caribbean, there are various reports of PMCs being hired and used to smuggle drugs for the cartels with their wide range of experience. What have you heard about these reports and how likely do you think they are?
Well, anytime there's money involved and there's risk and danger, then that's a conflict market, and that's what attracts mercenaries, whether it be 3,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or today. I've heard rumors, but I can see the possibility. I'll just say that drug cartels will start to lean on the expertise of the industry, as well as some of the plausible deniability that they provide, because they provide, one of the chief selling points of using mercenaries is that if they get caught, it's more difficult to link their actions back to the client. Not impossible, but more difficult. And that's very appealing if you're in an illicit economy. But I can also see a scenario where the United States might hire privateers, which are the same people in some ways. But privateers are basically sea mercenaries that work for a country.
And it's not just the big players using the PMCs these days, it's a lot of smaller nations as well. So can you take us through what sort of countries tend to use private military contractors?
Well, right now, like a privateer technically is like, let's go back to the Caribbean, but let's go back to the 1600s or 1500s. So everybody remembers Pirates of the Caribbean and Johnny Depp and so forth. And, and of course we like to, make fun of that, but there's some truth in that. So back in the, 1600s, 1700s, Spain and England, which were superpowers, were vying for the very lucrative sugar trade in the Caribbean. But the problem is that, they would escalate, they'd get into an arms race and who can build the most frigates. But they couldn't match each other, and it sort of spun out of control. So what they would both do is they would hire privateers. These are private warships. And they could come from anywhere. So they could come from, say, Boston, or they could come from, Colombia or wherever, Brazil. And they would fly their client's flag, whether that be, for example, Great Britain. And the deal was this: the Parliament of Great Britain would give that sea captain a letter of marque, which is like a contract, and it says you can go after any Spanish vessel you see, and you should kill it or capture it, and you get to keep some or all or of the booty you collect, and we will try to and you'll be like on team UK. We'll do our best to protect you. And so both sides would do this. They were basically hiring mercenaries of the sea, but they called them privateers. Now, the problem with private warfare is what happens when the contract is done? What happens when the client goes away? Well, we see on both land and sea private warfare is that the privateers became pirates. And this created a huge blight of piracy in the Caribbean, hence, Pirates in the Caribbean. These were former privateers whose letters are marked, were revoked because they kind of went, the client didn't need to hire them anymore. So they became sort of mercenaries of the sea, or AKA pirates. And that dynamic has not changed. I find it ironic today that this industry may be embryonic in the Caribbean today, not over the sugar trade, but over the drug trade.
Well, that leads me to a really interesting hypothetical. If we can hire PMCs to attack private civilians, if we can hire them to attack rival cartels, if we can even hire them to do the dirty work for nation states, what stops a company hiring a PMC to attack a rival company? What is the legal precedent if, let's say, ExxonMobil hires a group of PMCs to attack some BP oil rigs in the sea? Who receives the charges in that case? Would it be the likely Colombian PMC who actually carried out the attack? Would it be the company who pays them off, who would be pretty hard to track down and prove where the money came from, as it's definitely going to go through a bunch of shell companies? Would it be the UAE, as the PMC company is likely registered in the United Arab Emirates? What precedent do we have at the moment when it comes to this sort of an issue?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. So I think that this scenario is not far-fetched. Let's back up a bit. 40 years ago, if you told somebody, mercenaries would return, and that, they'd laugh at you. 30 years ago, if you said that the United States was going to use, private military companies, some would say mercenaries like Blackwater in its wars, they would laugh at you. 10 years ago, if you said extractive industry was starting to use this new private industry, this private security industry, people would laugh at you. But now look at us. We have the extractive industry is starting to lean heavily on the private military industry because they are tired of being shaken down from their point of view by host nation governments. So if you're working in Nigeria with an oil rig, of course the government of Nigeria is, corrupt and sucking you dry. And you, of course, are in some ways abetting that corruption. And also think of this. I mean, the CEO of Nissan, Carlos Ghosn, or the ex-CEO and president, he was under house arrest in Tokyo for corruption by the Tokyo authorities. And a bunch of mercenaries, former American Green Beret mercenaries, pulled like this perfect CIA paramilitary operation to exfiltrate him from Tokyo to Beirut, which has no extradition treaty with Japan. And rich people around the world saw him get away with that and are thinking, wow, I could do that too. Or, hiring mercenaries to assassinate the president of Haiti and essentially get away with it. People around the world are starting to wake up to this new tool, if you will. And the extractive industry is one of the early users of this industry, mostly for defense. But you can imagine in a place where the reason it's extractive industry is because they have to go where the asset is, whether it be oil or gas or timber or mines. And as they will tell you, and I used to work in this industry, all the easy places have already been extracted, shall we say. All the easy oil places. Now you have to go to the hard places. Places like parts of Central Africa, like the Eastern Congo, which is full of, it's lawless. It's lawless land. And anytime you have no security, like anarchy, then, great deal of money to be made, and unconstrained political and economic rivalries, you have a market rich for potential for mercenaries. And the last 20 some years, we've been seeing the rise and return of mercenaries, both on land and sea. So the idea that in 10 or 20 years from now, big oil company 1 rents an army to take out big oil company 2. I think it's more likely than not. And I think that the idea that states can govern this, especially in places like middle of Africa or the middle of the Middle East, where it's lawless for the most part, I think that's nonsense. So I think we're going to see a return of private warfare by the middle of this century.
Is there any legal precedent actually set about how to deal with this action? Or is it simply when this happens for the first time, no one will know what to do?
It's uncharted. I mean, there's a lot of legal scholarship, but it's ivory tower scholarship, right? It doesn't touch the earth. I mean, so look at the case with America, the United States of America in Afghanistan. And it still wasn't solved. If you have a private military company and one of their, first of all, many of your listeners will remember in 2007 something called Nisour Square. This is an event in Iraq during the Iraq War where a sort of a squad of Blackwater contractors / mercenaries, killed 17, Iraqi civilians in the middle of downtown Baghdad because they thought they were terrorists. And what happened to them? Did they go to the brig? Did they go to jail? No, they went home. Right? Soldiers would have been court-martialed. They went home. Now, years later, they did get arrested under a highly politicized and questionable trial. They were sent to jail, and President Trump gave them a full pardon for all 4 of them. Right? If you fast forward that to recently, if you have a private military company like in Afghanistan or Libya, what happens? What happens if one of the private military members, like completely kills or massacres a family? And let's just say that private military guy is from Colombia. Now, where is that tried? Is that tried in Colombia? Is that tried in Libya? Is that tried in wherever the private military company is based, which is probably Dubai? Or is it tried nowhere? The answer is it's tried nowhere. There's so much jurisdictional problems and law enforcement problems that they kind of walk free, right? So that's another, again, mercenaries have a lot of impunity. They exploit that, and it's partly a selling point. But if you fast forward, well, even if they don't fast forward, let's look at Libya today as a bigger example. No, the world has seen mercenaries in the rise for 30 years. The international community has very weak and ambiguous laws against mercenaries. Despite this, there's no real legal framework. It is both very ambiguous and very constricted at the same time, so it's really hard to prosecute a mercenary case. There's a joke that if your lawyer can't get you out of mercenary charges, you should shoot the lawyer. But even if you had strong international law against mercenaries or against, privateers, who's going to go into Libya, for example, and arrest all the mercenaries there? I mean, the place is swarming with mercenaries. Is the UN going to do it? No, they're not going to do it. Is it going to be NATO? They're not going to do it. And also, even if you found somebody to go in there, your mercenaries can shoot your law enforcement dead. They are very lethal. These are not the caricatures you see out of Hollywood. So, mercenaries are the one commodity that can literally resist arrest. Because of this, international law is not equipped to deal with the burgeoning, market for force that has been developing over the last several decades. And it's not going to start doing that in the next 5 or 10 years either. I think world peace would be easier to hope for than international law on mercenaries that's tight and enforceable. So I think that the trend of mercenaries will only grow.
And what about when these mercenaries are captured behind enemy lines? Let's say they're contracted for someone like the Russian government. Is it a case where the Russian government will come and bail them out and claim responsibility for them, or it's, you're a mercenary, sorry, we're not coming back for you?
Yes. That's all of the above. So part of the job, if you're a mercenary, I mean, let's look at the Colombian mercenaries who were in Haiti who assassinated the president. Is the Colombian government going to save them? No. That's part of the job risks when you take on the assignment. But there's some other questions which are really interesting too. So in 2018, the Wagner Group, a fairly powerful Russian-based military, mercenary group, works for the Kremlin, but they're not all Russians. They are Russian-speaking, but they're not all Russian citizens. They in eastern Syria, they attacked an oil site or a gas site where there was American special forces. I mean, really good ones like Delta Force and Green Berets. and there was a 4-hour firefight. Now that night, Americans, killed more Russians in that one night than any night during the entire Cold War. But the reason it didn't go to World War III is because the Russians were using mercenaries, and both sides could walk away from it with plausible deniability and say, oh, those weren't real soldiers. We can mutually ignore it. So again, mercenaries give you plausible deniability that all sides like to exploit. And Russia didn't care. I mean, and the Russian people didn't care. The Russians really do not like it when they see their soldiers coming home in body bags, but they don't care about dead contractors or dead mercenaries. Something Putin is very savvy to. Now, I talked to one of the Green Berets who was there that night, and he told me what happened. And one of the questions that they didn't know the answer to was, what happens if we catch one of these guys? They're under the laws of war. How do we treat them? Do we have to, treat them like prisoners of war? And we still don't know, because the laws of armed conflict are still really stuck in the 20th century. They're not updated to modern warfare. And there's no provision for mercenaries in laws of war in the 20th century, at least none that's very clear. So we're on a new legal frontier here as mercenaries grow, both in their potential and their scope and what they can do, especially when you hire them to do things you don't want to do, to get your hands dirty. What happens if you catch them? How do you know who they're really working for? They may not know who they're really working for. And how do you maintain accountability? These are all open questions, maybe not in theory, but in practice.
These aren't just dudes with rifles anymore. PMC companies now have access to drones and rockets and even in some cases submarines. Are PMCs becoming better armed these days? Does it indicate they're going to be going into hairier and hairier operations?
They're really good. I mean, they're not, PMCs are no threat to a place like Australia, but they are a threat to places that Australia might care about. And, in the hands, if you think about who their clients are, they're super rich, whether they're countries like the UAE or they're companies, or they're like the CEO of Nissan. And they can do, the mercenary world, think of it this way. Think of it, it's like a big pyramid, okay? Just like any industry, I suppose. At the bottom, which is most, we call those tier 3 guys. They're not very good. They're like former, regular infantry guys. They can do guarding. They could do guard duty, right? They can defend oil pipelines and stuff like that. In the middle, or tier 2, they're slightly better. They can do some offensive things. And tier 1 is like special operations, sort of paramilitary stuff. And they can be very effective. They can do, and all of them, and some of these companies can be very clever and how, bang for the buck, if you will. Small arms are easy to get. And now that the U.S. has left Afghanistan and abandoned a lot of weapons in Afghanistan, you should expect to see that on the black markets sometime in the weeks ahead. They can also are very good at jury rigging things. So they can take an off-the-shelf drone and turn it into a kamikaze for like a small kamikaze air force. They can take rubber, these fast boats that you see, SBS and SEALs use, and they can wield them for great effect. We, at least in the United States, are so accustomed that unless the weapon system costs like $100 billion, it's useless, which is totally not true. These folks, like good private sector innovators, can do more with less, and they do more with less. And when you have them working in, they're not going to places like Western Europe or North America. They're going to fragile, conflict-ridden places where it just takes a little nudge to move the sort of the piece on a game board. So if you look at like Libya or Central Africa, Central African Republic, or parts of the Middle East, or even Afghanistan today, You don't need to have a huge military to get results. You just need to be cunning and clever about where the pressure points are, and you can use mercenaries in combination with disinformation, in combination with cyber attacks to do some very effective things. And that's why we should not underestimate, it's just a bunch of guys with Kalashnikovs. That's not true. They have a lot of sophisticated weaponry, and they're also deploying it in new and cunning ways. And so that's really the threat.
The other theatre we'll probably do a full piece on later on is PMCs in cyberspace. Now, it sounds very far-fetched, but you can take us through how this works.
Privatized force is not just limited to kinetic force on the ground, whether it be over land or over water. We're seeing an increase of cyber mercenaries. Some are like Hackback Companies. These are private hackers who will, if your company is attacked, they will go after whoever, they will find and attack whoever hacked you. Right. And they've been around for 10 or so years. They're very controversial. They can't save what's been hacked, but they can kick butt. And that, in theory, is supposed to deter other hackers. So if you've some hackers, whether the private sector or the Russian or Chinese, and they see two companies are going to hack, and one has a hackback company behind it, they're not likely to go after. It's a hardened target. So hackback companies are illegal in places like the United States of America, but the Fortune 500 is increasingly looking at them because, the U.S. government is not defending them. And they're saying like, well, okay, America, if you're not going to defend me, then we have to defend ourselves. And so some of them are turning to hackback companies. But it's actually more scary than that. So it's also, there are companies, there are people, and there are governments who are also hiring like straight up mercenaries of the cyber world. So recently in 2021, there were they were former hackers for the US's National Security Agency, which is like the secret, that's America's like offensive secret hacking reserve, if you will. They're kind of like that, one foot in the military and one foot in something else. And they do a lot of America's offensive hacking for them. And 3 of these guys that we know of have been secretly working for the UAE. And you're thinking, like, that's interesting, but isn't, like, if you're an American, isn't the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, aren't they an ally of America? And the answer is not really. So it's funny when it comes to physical warfare, like in the Persian Gulf, the UAE and America are pretty closely aligned in terms of Navy and warships and land forces. But when it comes to cyber, the UAE is not a friend of the United States. And we have to start to get more nuanced in how we think about this because, war takes place in several domains, not just land and sea, but also in, space and cyberspace. And the fact that the UAE was hiring some of America's best hackers and using them against America shows you what a marketplace for force, how it actually functions. And it's not just land warfare or sea warfare. It's now cyber war too. And the reason why this is so important is because, look, the barriers of entry into the cyber world is much lower than in, land warfare or sea warfare. You don't, yes, you have to get the skills, but you need the skills also if you're going to be a Green Beret or a Navy SEAL or something like that too. But you don't need to have all the kit, and you can travel and nobody can arrest you because of you're doing illicit arms trade for your stuff. So, I don't know, maybe are we going to have some sort of licensing regime now where, armed and dangerous hackers have to, be on a list like, well-known special operators? I don't know, but we're seeing a world where private warfare and conflict and competition, whatever you want to call it, is no longer terrestrially bound. It's now in places like cyberspace. And who could be our friend on the Earth may be our enemy in cyberspace. And that's going to be a new twist for modern warfare and the alliance systems.
War is changing. The clean work and parades are being done by the national armies, and the dirty work is increasingly being done by PMCs. In the West, we may see the difference between soldiers misbehaving and private companies and go, well, it's a private company. But to people in Africa, that distinction may not be so obvious. To people living in places like the Central African Republic, they see firsthand that these well-armed foreigners come in, they shoot civilians left and right, they take the resources, and then they send it back home. No flags, just guns. So how did it get this way? How did PMCs become the pointy end of the spear in the darkest corners of the world? When we answer that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. From Russia with Guns.
So over the past decade, we've seen Russian PMCs really expand, both in terms of how many countries they're operating in and also where those countries are. So a decade ago, back in 2010, 2011, we had PMCs only in 1 or 2 countries. We started to see an increase after 2014 with the Russian PMCs being deployed to Ukraine. And since 2015, we've seen a roughly 7-fold increase in the number of countries where Russian PMCs are operating, going from about 4 countries in 2015 to 27 now today in 2021. And this is based on open source analysis. This is where we have concrete proof of them, but we have also seen different rumors of PMCs operating in other countries, so the true number may be even higher than 27. Not only has the number of countries that they're operating in increased, they've also spread further abroad just in terms of locations. We now have them operating on at least 4 continents, and particularly in the last few years, we've really seen an expansion further out of area in places like Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, where PMCs had not been operating in such force earlier in the decade.
Catrina Doxsee is an expert in counter-terrorism and irregular warfare at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's the Associate Director for the CSIS Transnational Threats Department and sits on the editorial board for the Irregular Warfare Initiative. She joins us today.
So something that we're seeing with Russian PMCs such as Wagner, where although they are the connection to the state is deniable, particularly since PMCs are technically illegal in Russia, they're working in accordance with broader political agreements that the Kremlin is pursuing with different states. So we've seen this especially as Moscow pursues a series of different security cooperation agreements and other foreign policy agreements with partners in Africa, including some of their recent foreign policy convenings that include a lot of the governments in sub-Saharan Africa. One particular example where we see this blending of diplomatic or even UN-sanctioned activities with the deployment of PMCs is in the Central African Republic, where we see that Russia has made a deal with the Central African Republic to offer weapons and equipment and security support services that was actually, they were granted a waiver by the United Nations to do so. But in the course of providing this equipment and providing what they're calling civilian trainers to actually train the local forces, the many or all of the civilian trainers who are going in are actually being drawn from PMCs like the Wagner Group to accomplish this task. And we've actually seen with the most recent UN reporting that in addition to just offering training services and other combat support tasks, we actually now have reports of Russian PMCs independently conducting combat tasks, not even integrated with local forces, but leading their own combat tasks and including combat missions that have resulted in widespread human rights abuses and deaths of civilians.
We did an entire piece about 18 months back on who the Wagner Group are and why they are so important to this story. So feel free to pause this, go back and listen to that, and come back here. But if you're happy with just a quick summary, the Wagner Group are a Russian private military company run by St. Petersburg hot dog salesman Yevgeny Prigozhin. The group has been very active in Crimea, Yemen, Libya, the Central African Republic, South America, and the Sahel, as well as many other theaters. And unlike regular PMCs, Wagner is very close to the Russian government, with Wagner's leadership regularly sitting in high-level meetings with the Kremlin defense officials. Wagner even trains right next to where the Russian special forces train. Wagner are quickly becoming the pointy end of the Russian stick, being shoved into the hairiest situations Russia has at the moment, and give the Kremlin plausible deniability when it comes to crimes. The other oddity about the Wagner Group is that unlike someone like Executive Outcomes, a private military company out of South Africa, Wagner takes its orders almost solely from the Kremlin. They don't act like a private military company who simply take jobs from the highest bidder. Wagner have been operating very heavily at the moment out of the Central African Republic, extracting resources and killing numerous African citizens in the process. These operators are technically just civilians on either a working visa or a tourist visa in the Central African Republic. So how is this not a crime? How is it fine for them to be shooting civilians out in the open?
It's complicated in that it's all wrapped up in this broader conflict that's going on in the state. And I think that that's one of the reasons that PMCs, particularly those that are focused on combat tasks, really benefit from these arrangements with states that have weak governance, that are facing strong security threats, ongoing conflicts, that they can integrate in. And much of this is done under the guise of the course of warfare. So it certainly is important that this is being monitored, that the UN is coming out with these reports. They had one report earlier on in March 2021 with some allegations of human rights abuses, but then most recently in the June 2021 UN Security Council report, there was pretty damning evidence of widespread human rights abuses conducted by Russian PMC forces in the country that frankly demand more of an international response, but with poor local governance, weak local enforcement systems, there's not a lot that is able to be done on the ground, particularly when the activities of these groups are sanctioned by the ruling government. I think it's also important to note, especially in a country like the Central African Republic, that not only do we see these growing concerns around human rights abuses in the course of leading these different assaults on villages and in the course of attacks where they've indiscriminately targeted citizens. But we've actually seen ongoing human rights abuses and crimes against local populations, even just in the course of setting up training camps and local basing in the country. So it's long been reported in local Central African media that the villages that are adjacent to or nearby different Wagner Group training camps have been reporting that there have been crimes against villagers, including the abduction and rape of women in those villages. So this has been an ongoing problem in these areas, and one that thankfully now is getting some attention, but I think really demands more international attention and response, particularly when the Russian forces were initially able to go into the country due to a UN waiver that permitted it.
PMCs more and more are taking on full combat roles rather than just security roles in various theaters around the world. We've seen Russian PMCs on the front lines of Libya, Syrian PMCs in Nagorno-Karabakh, Emirati PMCs in Yemen. So why are people looking to PMCs to act as the shock troops in these conflicts?
These PMC deployments have often come on the heels of other foreign policy and security cooperation agreements. But some of it also is just a matter of making the lowest bid or the most attractive bid. And so one case where we saw this, and we actually saw this backfire, was in Mozambique, where the Wagner Group won the contract to be able to assist the local government with combating the Islamist insurgency in Cabo Delgado, the country's northernmost province, largely because it underbid its rivals. And there's been a lot of analysis on this, that it's kind of a mix in these cases of the Wagner Group or other Russian PMCs offering their services at a lower price, and also this lure of improved relationships with Moscow, because there is this understanding that even though it's more of a hidden connection, there is still this sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge understanding that they are connected to Moscow. So in Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado, Wagner was able to get the contract over other competitors such as Umbra Aviation, such as OAM, that have a lot more experience in the region. And ultimately, we kind of saw that the local government got what they paid for, in that Wagner was not prepared to fight in the local conditions. And they, in addition to not being prepared to fight in the brush, they were not even able to fully integrate with the local forces due to language barriers, due to cultural differences, and just lack of preparation for the combat tasks at hand.
So why is Russia willing to do it at such a cheap price then? Are they getting kickback somewhere else? Is there something we're not seeing?
So some of it is certainly kind of being funneled back through this series of shell companies, particularly when you're looking at something like Wagner that is connected back to Prigozhin. You see this series of different shell companies that operate back to kick back some profits to different Russian oligarchs. But you also see, in addition to whatever monetary deal might be made, there are often other deals related to natural resources that are baked into that initial PMC agreement. So, as I mentioned earlier, we've really seen this trend where Russian PMCs are pursuing these relationships, in particular with states that have weak governance, ongoing security challenges, and rich natural resources. And this is something that kind of makes the African deployments, and to some extent some in other regions such as Latin America, distinct, which is this strong economic component, because it's not just a matter of being paid to send soldiers in to fight a conflict or to train local forces. A big part of it is also getting mining concessions or different deals to access local energy resources. So, for instance, in Mozambique, a big emphasis was on starting to prospect for the natural gas resources that had been recently discovered offshore, and to build in some of those economic benefits, as well as any monetary sum that was being paid. Similarly, in some of the other countries we've seen them deployed to, there have been different mining concessions around gold, around gems, around chromium, and other natural resources.
And how tied into these Wagner operations are the Russian forces? Is Russia assisting them in transportation or resupplying or refueling, or is this just a completely separate operation just conducted by Wagner?
So the exact connection back to the Kremlin is a little bit murky, although we do have, in a lot of different cases, different hints of cooperation with different Russian intelligence services, including the GRU and FSB. But in terms of the actual weapon shipments, we see planes coming in to drop off these weapons. We've seen satellite imagery tracking some of this, particularly in Libya. There's been a lot available, including some imagery that's been released by AFRICOM. But across all of these, we see these shipments coming in, and often PMCs helping to accommodate the deliveries, helping to unload planes. But the quality of these shipments has also been fairly mixed. So certainly in a lot of these cases, having weapons and equipment come in has been a huge boon to the local conflict. But we also see some kind of anecdotal stories coming out of some of these places where what's being sent is maybe not quite up to par. Yeah, so for example, we have local reporting in the Central African Republic that in October 2020, there was a shipment of 10 BRDM-2 armored vehicles that was sent into the airport in the capital. And this was intended to be sort of a large display of the power of Russian equipment coming in to help protect the country. This also sort of fits in with some of the broader information operations and propaganda that the PMCs were supporting in support of the relationship with Moscow and with the Russians that were there for assistance. So they paraded these armor vehicles through the city. They had Russian diplomats who were in the city there to view this. The president was there to view this. And yet, for all of the pomp and circumstance around this, one of the tanks broke down immediately after it exited the AN-124 that they were delivered on. And then two more broke down as they drove through the city as part of this supposedly celebratory parade. And so there have actually been local sources writing opinion articles about this and really flagging the fact that, you know, some of these weapon deliveries they're trying to sell them to the population as, oh, look at these great powerful weapons and equipment that we're getting from our Russian partners. But then you look at it and it's breaking down in the middle of this big ceremonial event. And there's this growing sense in some quarters of, okay, but they're giving us the leftovers. They're giving us these used vehicles that don't even work right. And so there's definitely this mix in quality that also has sort of a corresponding effect on how the Russian partnership is perceived by the local population.
Apart from the Central African Republic and Mozambique, where else might we find Wagner operating at the moment?
So in addition to the example of the Central African Republic, of course, they were in Mozambique. They actually left Mozambique in 2020 after a series of profound failures. So they are, as far as we can tell, no longer operating in Mozambique. But we also have taken a look at pretty robust case studies in places like Sudan, where they've now sort of reduced their role under the transition government, but are still very much present. So in Sudan, you once again had Russian PMCs performing different paramilitary tasks, helping to train local forces, providing intelligence. They got these mining concessions for gold mines and were providing subsequent security services, both at the mines and also to individuals in the government. And there's been this interesting shift in the country since the transition government took over, where some of the troops that had been in Sudan have actually redeployed to the Central African Republic now that there is a bit less demand for their services. But they've also been ramping up some of their information operations. They actually had pursued a deal to get basing rights at Port Sudan on the Red Sea, which was actually an agreement that was originally part of the deal with Bashir when they originally went to Sudan, but that was continued with the transition government and has now been put on hold due to increasingly warm relations between the U.S. and Sudan. But Russia is trying to still push its way in there, still get some information operations out to the people really in favor of Russian presence at the port and in the country in general. So we see that activity ongoing. We've also seen them participating pretty robustly in Madagascar, where initially Wagner Group contractors were deployed in 2018 to assist with the presidential election in exchange for some different contracts related to port renovation, as well as more access to mining, including chromium, magnesium, and gold. Outside of those countries where we've sort of done deep case study deep dives, we also see them operating in places like the DRC, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Congo, in Chad, in Nigeria. Most recently, in the news, we've seen a focus on a potential deployment of Wagner to Mali, where we had previously had some reports of presence, but now there's ongoing discussion over a more formal deployment to Mali and assistance there. There's also a lot of concern in places like Guinea, where we've seen recent coups and transition governments coming in, that this is, again, this perfect storm for PMC activities, and it's very possible that we're going to see those activities ramping up.
So Russia is taking over the security for a number of the destabilized African states. Surely, though, if you're the leader of one of these countries, you'd be pretty worried about putting your security in the hands of another country who often stands to benefit from the instability in yours. If it's Russian mercenaries who provide security, surely they can either prevent or allow coups to take place to whatever benefits Moscow most.
In these countries where Russia is using PMCs, it doesn't really have much of an incentive to try to ensure long-term, stable, good governance. Russian PMCs flourish most in countries where you have weak governance that is dependent on them. So there's been some analysis of this already, looking at countries like the Central African Republic and confronting the fact that while Russian PMCs are deployed there ostensibly to provide security assistance and to put an end to conflict, the PMCs have no incentive to actually do their job well enough to end the conflict, because then they're out of a job, then the deal is over. And so to some extent in these countries, if you think about the incentives that Russian PMCs are working with and that Moscow has, there's this incentive to do their job well enough that they're not going to be kicked out and replaced like they were in a place like Mozambique, but to still allow some kind of low-level instability, some kind of ongoing weakness that necessitates ongoing dependence on the PMCs, and then in the larger scope, this ongoing dependence on Moscow.
This is a legal powder keg waiting to happen, as countries get more and more brazen about the use of PMCs. So far, the major powers do see the advantage in having a force you can use to go in and do your dirty work, that if caught you can simply deny knowing anything about. And every side knows that once you prosecute these guys, it opens up a Pandora's box of not only current crimes, but past crimes in any number of these countries. Everyone is too invested to simply stop using PMCs. But what happens when one player goes too far? What happens when a private company goes to war with another private company? The incentive's right there. Knock out one oil rig of your competitor, and that's millions taken away from them, as well as the added millions of you selling more to meet the demand. So what happens when, not if, when this kind of scenario unfolds? Who is legally responsible? Well, for that, we turn to our third guest.
Part 3. Corporate Retreat.
Well, mercenarism is outlawed, which means under international law you're not allowed to become a mercenary. Obviously, the stipulations in international law in the anti-mercenary convention are kind of specific, so you need to tick every of these, I think it's 8 different attributes that need to be qualified and in order for you to become a mercenary. And so unless they are being, if one of them is not qualified, then you're actually not a mercenary. So it's very difficult to actually attribute someone and make someone a mercenary under international law. But it's fairly specific in the way that you are an individual who's in it for individual gain rather than commercial gain. You're not working for a company or a registered entity that can be held to account anywhere, whether in the contracting country or in the operating country. And you're doing it, you're not a member of this particular country, whether you're not a member of you're not part of that conflict, you're an external party to that, and you're basically doing it for private gain. If you're a private military contractor, by definition you're a contractor. You have a contract with a company. That company is registered somewhere. This company can be held to account. You're not operating for private individual gain, but you're doing this for business gain. And business profit, and the business, in order to generate profit, will have to adhere to certain laws and regulations. And obviously the most important element in terms of differentiation, but also that has become a kind of a blurry line. But 10 years ago, the main distinction was that if you're a mercenary, you're involved in direct combat. While if you're a private military and security contractor, you're providing security services which are defensive in nature, and if they are armed, then you're ever only going to use lethal force when as a means of last resort, in a very much in a defensive manner to protect a client or protect whatever it is that you need to protect. While a mercenary is understood to be actually actively engaged in warfighting.
Andreas Krieg is an associate professor of strategic studies at King's College in London, a professor at the UK Defence Academy, a fellow at King's Middle East, CEO of Amina Analytica, and author of Surrogate Warfare, all about the issues of PMCs. We are thrilled to have him on the show today.
So you mentioned Wagner Group before. It's one of these case studies, but I think the most transformational event for me has been the hiring of Reflex Limited in the UAE by Abu Dhabi in 2011 in the wake of the Arab Spring, where Abu Dhabi was building a mercenary force. And I'm saying here mercenary force because they were supposed to actually use lethal force in a proactive and offensive manner, initially only domestically against potential uprisings, and then later on also in an expeditionary function, because they were used in Yemen and Somalia as well. And the UAE have really changed the approach to mercenarism, also around the Horn of Africa, and particularly in Yemen, because they were actively involved in, and are still actively involved in war fighting, have also been used in Libya. I think that has been transformational because they use the term private military company because these are companies that are registered in Abu Dhabi or in the UAE as companies, and they hire contractors to work for these companies. So they're not loose individuals of the type that we had in the 1970s, which we would call the dogs of war. But these are contractors who work for companies. But obviously, the UAE law is an entirely different one to Western countries. The regulations are very different, so they are actually involved in direct war fighting, and so they've kind of eroded some of or undermined some of that distinction that we would have made 10 years ago, because they pose as contractors when in reality they're probably more mercenaries.
When you speak to people who are pro PMCs, they'll tell you that piracy has been all but solved by private military companies working out of the Horn of Africa. Do you think they're right to say that, or frankly, it's not true and piracy is still a problem in this region of the world?
There are a lot of elements to that question. I think undoubtedly, if you speak to people who've been involved also on the military side of counter-piracy and anti-piracy in around the Horn of Africa, they will tell you that the private security industry had a very crucial role to play. I mean, the dying down of attacks, and it's been a lot safer to actually passage through these areas now than it has been 8 years ago, and that's definitely due to the fact that private security companies have acted as a deterrent in a way that regular militaries and conventional navies were not able to do it. And I remember the head of NATO, the NATO operation or EU operation Atalanta. He said once, the comparison is, if you look at how vast the area was, and if you look at how many platforms they had, it would be like patrolling the whole of France with 2 police cars. So this was always something that required teams on board of vessels, and vessel protection teams did make a difference. And because these were commercial platforms, these vessels, they needed to have a commercial answer to what was essentially a commercial issue. So the navies had a role to play in this, but it was absolutely crucial to have private companies providing that service in also making vessels safer and also acting as a deterrent. I think that was an absolutely crucial element to this. Obviously, there are instances where shipping companies were scared of premiums going up from insurance companies, and that's why they didn't report potential issues and incidents. But incidents have gone down anyway. I mean, by any metric, if you look at the research being done also by insurance companies, they will tell you the same thing, that how important it was to actually have contractors on board. So I would say that contractors played a very, very crucial role, and are continuing to play a crucial role actually in West Africa, if you look at the Gulf of Guinea. And there's been a bit of a race to the bottom here, where especially shipping companies are trying to cut corners and operating with companies that are not very credible and haven't been able to provide the same level of service. And that somewhat tarnishes the reputation of the entire industry. But I think for the most part, people now realize in government, in the UK and in the US as well, are realizing that private security companies, when they are operating as registered companies in the UK or in the US, they provide a certain level of service. There's self-regulation in place. There's certain standards in place that ensure that that this is a fairly safe and very good a means of providing a service that is essentially needed. And whatever happens in the third world by companies that are locally registered is a different story.
Even in the world of PMCs, Russian maritime PMCs have been known to be particularly brutal, knowing that their legal position is pretty dubious. There's been multiple accounts of Russians posting footage online of simply machine gunning Somali vessels as soon as they come into view, killing everyone aboard. But what is the legal precedent around this? Is there anyone that can charge the Russians with this, or is it frankly international waters on a very, very delinquent Somali government court system?
And that's the key issue with private maritime security has been from the beginning that it is a bit of a grey zone legally. Obviously, when you have a private contractor operating on land, it's quite clear that, in which jurisdiction. It's not quite clear, but it's fairly clear in which jurisdiction that individual is. Obviously, there have been all kinds of issues in Iraq and Afghanistan where there were arrangements by the US government with the Iraqi government or Afghan government to give contractors amnesty at times, which was obviously also problematic. But at least you had someone to prosecute. You kind of knew what laws would apply. Now, when you're if you look at the shipping sector, and that is. Generally, the shipping sector is very diversified, is a very international, transnational domain, and it becomes increasingly problematic when you have contractors on board. So you have a flag state that might be state number one, that might be different from the state of ownership of that vessel. So the company that owns the vessel might not be registered, and is most likely not registered in the same country as the flag state. At the same time, the contractor might be from a different nationality and working for a private security company that again is registered in another country. And then they are operating potentially in coastal areas of other states, whether it's Somalia or Yemen, and then you have the another state involved, which is the coastal state, and then you're already now we're at 5 or 6 different countries potentially being involved in an incident like that. So if it happens in international waters, then the laws of the sea apply, which again are not very specific on this. It's usually down to the flag state if something happens, but obviously, it's very difficult to prosecute, and we had a lot of instances, by the way, not just involving contractors, but also involving vessel protection teams, which were provided by states. There was an infamous case in 2012 by an Italian vessel protection team, which were actually Italian law enforcement on an Italian flagged vessel that were in Indian coastal waters, and they opened fire at a fishing vessel, which was Indian, killing 2 of the fishermen on board. And that caused a huge outcry because obviously the Indian Navy then seized that ship and arrested this Italian vessel protection team. And it kind of created a very long-lasting diplomatic feud between the countries because they didn't know, whose jurisdiction it was. But the Indians said it happened in our coastal waters, so Indian law applies. And if you use armed force, you will be trialed under Indian law. Now, the issue in Somalia or Yemen is there is really no state to prosecute. There's also no real Coast Guard or Navy that could actually enforce the laws of Yemen or Somalia or any of the coastal states. And that kind of creates a Wild Wild West situation where you can get away with murder. And when these things are not reported, because Somalis that are being shot at or killed, if there is a survivor, where would they go to actually ask for reparations, or to actually who are they going to sue and how they're going to do it? And that has created this kind of a grey zone which allows companies to get away with murder, and it is therefore based on regulations that companies adhere to and best management practices that are being enforced by most of the Western-based companies. But if you're talking about a Russian company, they will obviously they will say we only adhere and we only fall under Russian law, and they do get amnesty under Russian law, and basically they do get away with murder, and there's literally nothing that could be done. And anyway, who would start an investigation in an incident like that? Who is going to trigger that? Because those people who have suffered the damage have nowhere to go to actually to claim the damage or to prosecute that particular vessel. So it is problematic. So usually it's down to the flag state of that particular vessel, because they're the ones, they're the territory, the only territory in international waters that is relevant. But usually these vessel states, these flag state countries that are based, Panama and countries in the Caribbean, small islands which are tax havens, essentially, also don't have the infrastructure to prosecute and bring any pressure to bear on those companies who operate the vessels. So it is kind of a grey area, and that's obviously a highly problematic element of it.
Can you take us to the issue of floating armories?
So most companies were not allowed to actually bring armed protection teams on board when they were leaving port, because the port countries would not allow this. So what happens is that you have these contractors going on board of vessels without arms, and then being armed on international waters, where you had floating vessels which were basically armories, supplying the contractors in international waters with arms, so that they can legally operate in as armed contractors. And then as soon as they would go back to port, they would either throw, and that happened a lot, throw the arms overboard in international waters, or have another of these floating armories coming around and picking up the arms before they disembark the vessel. It kind of shows you that whatever happens on international waters is kind of unregulated. And there are loads of issues that arose with floating armories getting into coastal waters of states, and that was seen as smuggling arms. One of these cases I remember was in Indian coastal waters, where the Indian Coast Guard was seizing one of these floating armories that by mistake went into Indian waters and then was seized and I think from what I remember, this case has also been going on for years. The contractors have been imprisoned, and they're still in prison as far as I know. But it also again goes to show that there are ways around it. So if there are regulations on land or even in coastal waters, when it comes to international waters, this is kind of the wild, wild west. And you can get away with quite a lot, particularly when you don't know who the client is, or if the client is actually based in a country where there is no legal infrastructure to go after them.
Do you think PMCs have reached their peak, or do you think we'll start to see them being used in far more complicated operations, possibly even state-to-state fighting or company-to-company fighting? What do you think the future for PMCs holds?
I think the future is wide open in a way that there is a lot more opportunity. My book on surrogate warfare really talks about how we are moving into a world where the assemblage between state and non-state actor is becoming the new norm. State capacities and capabilities are shrinking. We see less and less investments into militaries. In the United States, maybe not as much as in Europe, but we see in Europe a downsizing of the military, and that's a trend that's been going on ever since the end of the Cold War. It's capacities and capabilities that I think are lost, and I don't think will be reinvented. And that obviously creates, at the same time, we also need to understand that the challenges in that complex 21st century security environment are increasing, and they become a lot more diverse than the challenges that we were up against even 20 years ago. So a lot more non-state activity, a lot less security available by local government. You have a lot more failing states that are unable to provide or unwilling to provide security. So what it creates is a massive gap. So on the one hand, you have a lot more challenges, and on the other hand, you have a lot less capacity to actually deal with it in-house as states go. So what you're left with is a void of capacity and capability. And the industry is eventually going to, and it has, whenever it was called upon, was able to kind of fill that capacity capability gap, and providing services mostly in conjunction with state authority. So I'm not saying that the industry is working against the state. I think the idea is working with the state. And as surrogacy goes, so my idea about surrogacy is everything is about externalizing the burden of warfare, creating assemblages that between the state, that is the client, and a network of different actors that are operating somewhat directly or indirectly for the client state. And private security companies are one element of one such surrogate that states can operate with and do operate with. And I do see that the readiness to use them will increase. The future of military and security operation is private and is non-state. Whether this is commercial or not is a different question.
This issue is nowhere near being solved. With companies becoming more and more brazen, who knows what may lay ahead for the geopolitical landscape because of PMCs? Will the US simply hire PMCs to take back the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea? Will Russia just hire Wagner to invade Latvia and then claim they had nothing to do with it? What is the precedent? In 2014, when Russia took Crimea, they managed to solidify themselves on the ground and run the vote before the world could even figure out what to possibly charge Russia with. We need to figure out an answer to these legal questions now. We need to roadmap out this grey zone once and for all, before more boundaries get pushed and other players are forced to respond. Thank you so much for everybody who tuned into the show this week. It's been another big month here at the Red Line for us, with us taking on even bigger topics, heading towards our 150th guest, our 55th episode, and even more content and analysis coming out on our website. If you want to hear more about these events or get involved or jump on one of our pub quiz or Hearts of Iron games, you can find links and info on our Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, and Discord on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle MikeHilliard. Oz is in Australia. Otherwise, visit our website www.theredlinepodcast.com. As a small token of our appreciation, we're also reading out our latest Patreon's name to sign up as of time recording. So a big thanks goes out to Ronbo, who just pentupled his Patreon contribution. This show would not be possible without the support of amazing Patrons like Ronbo, who donate a small amount of money each week to help us keep this show going. I really cannot thank all of our Patrons nearly enough for their support, and if you feel like you could spare a couple of dollars, we'd greatly appreciate it. So forever on our website though, this episode is dedicated to Ronbo. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations if you want to take this subject further. The first is The New Rules of War by Sean Mcfate, an analysis on how the industry has unfolded over the last few decades. The second is Surrogate Warfare by Andreas Krieg, for an analysis on the legalities and the rules around private warfare. And the last is Blackwater by Jeremy Scahill, for a look at where all of this originally came from, with Blackwater's war crimes in Iran and Afghanistan. I want to thank our guests this week, Sean Mcfate, Catrina Doxsee, and Andreas Krieg. All of you were absolutely fantastic this week, and we look forward to having you back on the show soon. I also want to thank my staff, Owen Swift, the producer, Daniela Zavella and Perry Grace, our research assistants and writers, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. All of you are absolutely amazing, and each and every week you blow me out of the water with all your work. So I'm incredibly proud of this team and all the goals we're kicking. The last thanks goes out to you for tuning into the show. 55 episodes is a lot of content, and some of you have been here since the very start. And to those people, I give my absolute biggest thank you. The show will be back in another fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.